Good evening, and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Revival of the Greater Serbia Project. The Greater Serbia Project has been revived under President Aleksandar Vučić. Unlike under Milosevic, the agenda no longer involves mass murder, forced expulsions, or territorial capture. The campaign operates through stealth, flexibility, and patience, and has three chief elements: weakening neighbors, duplicitous diplomacy, and Russian assistance. The main targets of the revived Greater Serbia project are Kosovo, Montenegro, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Kosovo cannot be reabsorbed by Serbia, as there is no international support for such a reversal, and the Albanian population is determined to remain independent. Belgrade's objective is to indefinitely delay a final settlement in bilateral relations and to keep Kosovo uncertain about its future. The debates about partition and land swaps are a means to distract attention and stir conflict. A weak Kosovo enables Belgrade to increase its regional leverage. Although Montenegro is a NATO member, Vučić is intent on subduing its sovereignty and subordinating its foreign policy. Serbian officials interfered in Montenegro's elections to promote the nationalist opposition, which can weaken the country's Western orientation as part of the governing coalition. Bosnia-Herzegovina is the third major target. The country remains dysfunctional primarily because of the blocking policies of Republika Srpska. Its leader Milorad Dodik periodically threatens separatism to create a new Serbian state. Although Vučić avoids openly campaigning for Bosnian partition and Serbia's absorption, the calculation is that a wider regional crisis, combined with conflicts within Bosnia, will provide future opportunities for secession when the West is distracted. A second key component of Belgrade's approach is duplicitous diplomacy. Serbia seeks to balance the four major powers, Russia, China, US, and EU, and to benefit from each in imitation of Tito's strategy of non-alignment. This can assist the pan-Serbian project if Belgrade gains support from major international actors. The third element is Russian state assistance to weaken Serbia's neighbors. Moscow itself views Belgrade as a useful tool to undermine stability in the Western Balkans, limit Western integration, and expand Kremlin influence. Instead of direct confrontation that could provoke Western sanctions, Vučić operates by stealth to exploit the vulnerabilities of neighbors. Instead of a direct assault on nearby states, Vučić diminishes their independence by encouraging nationalist disputes and favoring local pan-Serbian parties. And instead of a rapid pursuit of regional dominance, Vučić is patient, calculating that time is on Serbia's side. However, it cannot be excluded that at some point the Kremlin may try to push or pull Vučić into a more direct regional conflict that will then preoccupy both the European Union and NATO. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Kurt Volker, former US ambassador to NATO, who also recently served as US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. He's currently a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining me on the show, Kurt.
Janusz, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm sure my audience is going to enjoy your insights today. And I really want to focus on questions of international insecurity and what one can see as escalating threats to both Europe, but also to America. Let me start with the US national security strategy,
Mhm.
which identifies Russia and China, the newest 2 years ago, the newest strategy identifies Russia and China as America's and the West's key adversaries in what is depicted as great power competition. Can you explain exactly what that means in practice?
Sure. Well, what's most important about that statement is that is a shift away from viewing terrorism and ISIS and failed states and climate change and all these other things as being principal threats to our security. So the fact that it is reverting to saying, no, what is the greatest threat to US interests in the world are these great powers is itself significant. The second is that while they are lumped together in one sentence, the two potential adversaries here are very different. China is a true strategic competitor of the United States in scale, in economy, in reach, in capacity, in technology. They play a substantial role in the global economy, in climate issues, in the South China Sea. They have territorial ambitions. They challenge U.S. presence in East Asia. So that is a real strategic competitor, and the U.S. has geared up to push back on China in many, many ways. Everything from tariffs on trade to presence in South China Sea and East Asia, political engagement and support with countries around China that are also concerned about China's rising assertiveness in the region. So there's a lot of pushback there. The contrast is Russia. Russia is seen as much smaller and, in fact, a declining power. However, they do have nuclear weapons that we need to be concerned about. And even though they are in relative decline, not on the scale of rising powers such as China, they nonetheless have an authoritarian system and a willingness and ability to apply force, particularly in the neighborhood of Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and so forth. They do threaten NATO. And then in addition to that, they are also using that force in places such as Libya or in Syria. And so while they may be smaller, they are playing a very aggressive role at the moment. So both of them require attention from the US as a matter of pushing back on these things to preserve a space for protecting US interests and protecting US allies and the values that animate the US and our allies.
Right, and as you say, Russia is a declining power and maybe not such a great power as compared to China, which is, as you said, the longer-term threat both to democracy and security. But nevertheless, it can do a great deal of damage to its European neighbors. However relatively weak Russia is compared to the US or China, it's still relatively strong compared to its neighbors. Is there a danger, Kurt, that by over-focusing on China, we may neglect some of Russia's subversive and assertive policy in its neighborhood?
I think there is something of a risk of that. There is a sort of, to me, kind of inexplicable desire on the part of both the previous Democratic administration, President Obama, and now President Trump, to really confront Russia. As a matter of policy, the Trump administration has done quite well, I think. Sanctions against Russia, increasing sanctions, restrictions on the diplomatic missions, support for lethal defensive arms for Ukraine, positioning U.S. military forces in Europe further forward, for instance, in Poland, Baltic states, Romania. So I think the actual policies of the U.S. have been very assertive. But nonetheless, there has been something of a grace around Putin where no one is confronting him directly. And we saw that during the Obama administration's reset policy as well. So I think there is a sense that people can underplay the Russian risk. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and then later seized Crimea, I think we were very flat-footed. We did not react quickly enough and strongly enough. Had we done so, I think we could have caused Putin to think twice before annexation. But because the West did not, I think he felt that there was no resistance and just moved right ahead. When you look further forward, you see a period of transition in the US. We go into presidential elections next month, then the final months of this term of the Trump administration. Whether Trump is reelected or whether President Biden wins the election, there will be a further period after inauguration of readjusting the government, bringing new people in. And I think Russia is trying to take advantage of this period of time where people are distracted to increase its assertiveness again. For instance, with what we've seen in Belarus and the role that it has played in supporting Armenia in the conflict with Azerbaijan.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to both of those, to Belarus, also to Ukraine and the South Caucasus. But because you mentioned U.S. policy, how do you assess the impact of sanctions, economic and financial sanctions on certain oligarchs, certain Russian businesses? As you said, they haven't included Putin himself, although some members of his inner circle. How do you assess those? How effective have they been?
I view them as effective and important. And I think it's important to keep sanctions in perspective. They have not fundamentally changed Russia's policy of aggression against its neighbors. They haven't caused Russia to withdraw from Crimea. However, they create a situation in which it may mitigate even worse that Russia may have done. It does stack up incentives for why Russia should seek to come to closure on some of these issues, such as Eastern Ukraine, and pull out of the Donbass and allow peace to be reestablished there. Because if they did so, some of these sanctions would be lifted. So I think people look at sanctions and say, oh, it hasn't achieved everything, then it's achieved nothing. I tend to view it the opposite. I think it achieves things every day by what it prevents and creates conditions which one day, when fulfilled, can lead to relief of sanctions. So I look at it through the other end of the glass. Sanctions don't work until the day they do. And then when they do, then you feel like you did the right thing by having them in place all along.
Right. And you had direct experience with Moscow. You served as U.S. Special Representative to the Ukraine negotiations, I think, for about 2 years. So you dealt directly with Russian officialdom and what I would call Bolshevik negotiating methods.
Indeed.
What can you tell us about Russian strategy and tactics as well as diplomacy?
Right. Well, that's fascinating because, first off, it is very top down. Putin is in charge. Nobody else is in charge. And so when you're meeting with Russian emissaries, both you and they are very conscious of that. Second, in the case of my counterpart, Vladislav Surkov, he was saying things that were completely untrue. He knew that they were untrue. I knew that they were untrue, and he knew that I knew that. And so he's doing this in order to see how I react and whether I stay focused on what our goals and principles are and try to steer the conversation into something productive and whether we can do anything together. I think the best you can hope for in negotiating with Russia is to completely disagree over our analysis of what's going on in the world and our objectives, but nonetheless agree on certain common actions that we both find beneficial for our own reasons. And I think we were approaching that in the case of the Donbass in 2019 until the U.S. impeachment process blew up the whole situation and caused Putin to go right back to where he was in 2016. In terms of style, I'd say that when Putin or when there is space for meaningful discussion, then I think that's quite possible to explore that with a Russian negotiator. And I did feel that we had some progress at that in discussions with Surkov. But when they decide that, no, we're not going to do anything, the whole thing is actually a charade. And that is how it kind of ended up.
Right. Let me turn, Kurt, now to Belarus, which has been absorbed in a national, I would say, national upheaval throughout the summer since the forged elections. Do you think the Kremlin is likely to use the opportunity to try and absorb Belarus in some sort of Russian federation or some sort of confederation with Moscow? And what impact would this have on the wider neighborhood?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say is we have to think about the things that Putin doesn't want. What are the things that Putin doesn't want with Belarus? First is that he doesn't want a democratic transition. He doesn't want a change of government through elections. Second, he doesn't want change of government through protests. He thinks that would be a bad signal for Russia as well, threatening his rule. Third, he doesn't want overt military intervention, not even at the level that he's done in Ukraine. He wants to stay under the radar and under the threshold. And thirdly, he could care less about whether Lukashenko remains in power, But what he doesn't want is a Belarus that is connected to Europe and the West. So if Lukashenko enforces that and subordinates Belarus to Russia, that's fine. If he doesn't do it, they'll find somebody else. So I think that's the framework for Russia looking at this. Within that, then, I think that Russia has pursued creeping control of Belarus. It has taken over the media, it has taken over the security services, it has very strong influence in the military, and it has called the shots on the political development since the election. So I think that is sufficient for Putin. He doesn't really need much more than that in order to achieve the objectives that he has that I just outlined. If it turns out that that strategy is not working, the protests are sustainable, that there is slippage in Belarus, Lukashenko is trying to balance off Russian influence by reaching out to Europe again, or conceding that there should be a free and fair election, things like that, or stepping down from power because of protests. That's the thing that I think could trigger the scenario that you're raising, is Russia invoking the federation with Belarus to assert more direct control. But for now, I think they're quite satisfied with the indirect control to achieve the objectives that we talked about.
Before we turn to the Balkans, I want to mention one other conflict which has erupted in the past 2 or 3 weeks, and that's the renewed war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over occupied Azeri territory. In a way, a restart of the war 30 years ago, which was never settled by this Minsk group dialogue process, and has led to a lot of frustration, I know, in Baku. I think 14% of Azeri territory is actually occupied, not just Nagorno-Karabakh, but also 7 surrounding districts. Is there a danger that this could seriously escalate and pull both Turkey, Russia, and possibly even Iran into a regional war?
Well, of course, there is that danger. I think it will be avoided. I don't think any of the parties really want that. But when a conflict has erupted and there is live fire going on, it can escalate, and so it would be very dangerous. To comment a little bit on this, I was involved a little bit with Minsk process things back when I was in the State Department as acting assistant secretary in 2007, 2008, something like that. And what struck me about this is that Russia never wanted there to be a peace agreement over Nagorno-Karabakh. The Minsk process was designed largely by Russia in order to perpetuate a frozen conflict, because weak, divided neighbors that have dependency on the outside creates an opportunity for Russia. The last thing Russia wants is peace there and a strong Azerbaijan that where the two are able to work together and connect an east-west corridor from Central Asia to Europe that doesn't go through Russia. So Russia wanted to maintain this conflict. I think more recently what we've seen is Russia stoking the conflict a bit. Reports of arms sales to Armenia, reports that they went through Georgian territory to go there, stoking Pashinyan to fire up the conflict a little bit, which otherwise he may not have done, and then reminding Pashinyan that Armenia depends completely upon Russia for security. And this is a way of reinforcing Russia's position there. I think Russia anticipated that Azerbaijan would react to this, and therefore also be able to remind Azerbaijan that Russia is the bigger power in the neighborhood and they need to be careful. And by being careful, it's not only about Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict, it's about energy, it's about East-West corridor, it's about business ties and so forth. So I think this was what Russia was trying to do. And also part of that strategy is diverting attention from protests inside Russia and from unpopularity of Putin and the changes that he's imposed on the political system there, and what's happened in the Russian economy, especially during times of COVID. So that's what I think happened. It did get a bit out of control. Azerbaijan reacted more strongly than anticipated. Turkey weighed in more strongly than anticipated. And then Russia had to scramble to try to calm things down. And we did see the meeting of the foreign ministers convened in Moscow, the Azerbaijani and Armenian foreign ministers. That led to an agreement on a ceasefire. Ceasefire not fully implemented, but I think we'll be returning to that, and we'll see this conflict gradually stabilize again in the next few weeks.
But what is Russia's objective here? As you said, Kurt, they've tried to keep both sides off balance, so both could be dependent in a way on Russia and not move westwards, but in a way be stuck with each other. Is the aim to insert peacekeepers maybe in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as maybe make Azerbaijan more dependent because they gave the amber light to the Azeri reclamation of some of their territories?
I think it is mostly just about reasserting Russia's dominance in the region, to remind both sides that Russia is indispensable for them. From the Armenian side for defense, from the Azeri side that they can't go too far without provoking a Russian response against Azerbaijan. So I think it's just about reinforcing Russia's role there.
This must also put Georgia in a delicate position. You just returned from Georgia a few days ago. How is the conflict seen in Tbilisi?
Well, it's very interesting, and I was fortunate enough to have a chance to meet the Prime Minister while there, and we talked about this. Georgia has been able to maintain good relations with both Armenia and Azerbaijan, even though they are in conflict with one another. This is important to Georgia. They've tried to assert a position of neutrality where Georgian territory would not be used to provide military supplies to either side, and they're trying to maintain that. They've offered good offices where they would like to be able to host dialogue, contact between the two sides with a degree of regional sympathy and understanding that you don't get through the Minsk process. So they've tried very hard to be a constructive player while this conflict is going on. And of course, one of the main motivators for this is that if the war escalates, of course, it would not only damage Armenia and Azerbaijan, but it would damage Georgian interests as well. And they want to see that prevented.
Right.
I should add this too, Jan, if I could. Georgia sees very clearly the importance of the relationships, particularly with Azerbaijan, when it comes to an east-west corridor of trade, logistics, data and internet communications, movement of goods and people. Georgia,
and gas, Balkans as well.
Oil, energy, electricity. Georgia has a vital interest of being connected to Europe. But Georgia, of course, is a country of less than 4 million people, so is not going to be a big magnet for European attention unless Georgia is the gateway to the much wider region of the Caucasus and Central Asia. And in order to be that gateway, Georgia needs the relationships going east as well. So it is a very strategic picture from seen from sitting in Tbilisi as well.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Turning now to the Balkans, Kurt, how do the West Balkans in particular figure in Russian strategy? I mean, is there a threat that Moscow could destabilize the region, create problems for both Europe and the United States? I mean, like another South Caucasus, but this time a little bit closer to Brussels.
Yeah, there are several dangers there stemming from Russian interventions and policies in the Balkans. In addition to returning from Georgia, I also just came back from Montenegro. In Montenegro, we've seen a pro-Western government lose elections to a coalition of parties, some of whom do not even support Montenegrin independence, are very pro-Serb and very pro-Russian. Russia's interests in this are first, to assert the primacy of the Russian Orthodox Church over Istanbul and the Ecumenical Patriarch, which it does through relationships with certain other Orthodox churches, as they do in Serbia. This is important to Russia because it is fighting for recognition or lack of recognition of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was granted autocephaly in 2018 by the Ecumenical Patriarch. Russia is still trying to assert dominance over the church in Ukraine. It wants to assert the dominance of the Russian church in the Balkans. Another is the relationships that countries have to the European Union and NATO. Russia feels that Croatia, Slovenia, Albania, Montenegro now all being members of NATO, Macedonia as well, or Northern Macedonia being a member of NATO, they feel this as a creeping annexation of the territory by NATO, and so they want to contest that. And the means they are contesting it is through nationalism, through the church, through energy policy to maintain reliance on Russian gas supplies, and it is very much a contest against Europe. Sadly, I don't think Europe or even the United States quite fully realizes how much of an effort Russia is putting into this and what a challenge it is to European and transatlantic interests in the Balkans. I hope that we're able to wake up a little bit and understand what Russia's up to and provide more engagement and support for those pro-democratic, pro-multi-ethnic, and pro-European forces in the Balkans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to come to this in terms of our next administration, what more it could be doing, whether it's a Trump or a Biden administration, what more it could be doing in the region. But let me ask you one question. You were in Podgorica, and Montenegro feels very much squeezed, I would say, between Russia and Serbia. Is the Vučić government in Belgrade doing enough to resist Moscow? They claim that they're resisting Moscow, but they're being battered by nationalists, by the church, by other groups, anti-Western groups. I mean, is Vučić trying to have it both ways? Is he trying to benefit from Russia's ambitions, or is he actually trying to resist Russia's ambitions?
Well, let's be fair to Vučić and say that he's in a very difficult position. Serbian society is very nationalist. The legacy of the Kosovo War weighs heavily on perceptions in Serbia. And since he doesn't have the EU membership and the deep ties to EU member states, he does benefit from economic ties to Russia. So you can understand with some sympathy the position that he's in. However, I do believe that he is not doing enough to push back on that Russian pressure, to engage with other countries in the region, to really resolve the trade disputes with Kosovo and work toward normalization of Serbia's relationships in the region and then with the European Union. And as seen from Montenegro, they view his role as having been rather duplicitous, of saying one thing in meetings while doing another. So I think that you can look at him with some sympathy of the difficulties he has, but at the same time, for the long-term interests of Serbia, I think you do need to see more pushback against Russia and a push towards Europe and a push towards closer ties to neighbors. Well, one thing, Janusz, if I could add this, and I know this is an area you care a lot about as well too. One of the issues in play in the Balkans is the idea of monoethnicity versus multi-ethnicity. And Serbia has consistently promoted an ethnic agenda in the region, whether it is supporting Republika Srpska, Serbs in Montenegro who are questioning the legitimacy of the state of Montenegro, or the legitimacy of the state, for instance, requiring the Serbian Orthodox Church to register as a church. Or you see this in Kosovo and northern Mitrovica. So Serbia has consistently pursued a mono-ethnic vision for the region. This is quite dangerous, and if pursued, would lead to border challenges and breakups of countries, everything from Albania, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, Bosnia. It's a dangerous pursuit. Meanwhile, you have others who have embraced a multi-ethnic vision of the region. That includes Northern Macedonia, it includes some in Bosnia, certainly includes Montenegro. And from the perspective of stability and security and the interests of the West, we need to be firmly behind multi-ethnic visions of society and not mono-ethnic states.
Right. Interesting points. Where does that leave Bosnia, of course, which is, I don't want to go too much into Bosnia at the moment, but that is the most difficult nut to crack in the region. Yeah, I was going to say it's both multi-ethnic, but it's also mono-ethnic in terms of its divisions.
Right, because of the divisions, exactly right. And what I see there is and I've said this many times over years, even when I was in government, that there needs to be a renewed international push to modify the constitution and governing structures of Bosnia. Those structures were put in place by international conferences. And in a way accepted by Bosnians, imposed on Bosnians, but they are dysfunctional structures. And what Bosnia needs is international support and assistance to try to renegotiate terms of governance as one country that would allow the country to operate more effectively. Certainly with guarantees of human rights and protections for ethnic minorities, but the current structures that create divisions inside the country along ethnic lines and that prevent effective governance are really holding the country back.
And I think one of the problems we've seen in the region, going back to what you were saying earlier about Vucic, is all countries, other than half of Bosnia, I suppose, have committed themselves to Western integration. Serbia seems to be in this sort of no man's land. It's almost like a neo-Yugoslavist approach, trying to balance Russia and the
Yes.
West and Europe and China, but it doesn't quite work in the modern era. How would you address that?
Well, I think you put your finger on it. That is a very archaic way of thinking. It may have a history in the non-aligned movement. It may have a history in Serbia's dominance of Yugoslavia and wanting to recreate or have a muscle memory of some of those relationships. But the fact is that Russia, as we said, is a declining power. It's an authoritarian state. It is one that does not support the interests of its neighbors or of countries where it engages. Rather, it tries to suppress those interests in favor of Russian unilateral advantage, and it holds countries back from realizing their potential. Meanwhile, Europe, the United States, NATO, etc., is all about helping people in different countries realize their own aspirations for building democracies, market economies, and having security. And Serbia is an outlier in this, looking backwards at the relationships of a bygone era, rather than seeing that there's really only one choice that makes sense for the future of the country, and that is to be part of a modern Europe.
Right, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to say a little bit about potentially the next administration, what our administration, what could be our agenda in the region, which is to try and build a sort of more effective regional front against Russian subversion of the Western Balkans, disinformation, corruption, other threats to national regional security. I mean, do you think this is a feasible idea?
Well, in terms of orientation, will that be the way the U.S. looks at the region? Yes, I think that's achievable. In terms of level of activity and engagement, will you see a more engaged, assertive, leading U.S. policy? I'm afraid I'm pessimistic about that. Whether it is a re-elected President Trump or a newly elected President Biden, I think domestic politics are driving everything in the United States right now, from COVID-19 to the economy, to questions about racial justice, to some of the economic and socialist policies put on the table by the Democrats. These are riveting attention in the United States. And whether it is no nation building abroad from President Obama or America First from President Trump, or what will come next in the next administration, I don't think you're going to see a lot of appetite in the U.S. political system for a deep engagement of the U.S. abroad. I think that's unfortunate. I think we can make a decisive difference in places like the Balkans. The people we have on both sides of the aisle are good, but I don't think you're going to see the commitment to American leadership, at least not now.
I want to come back a little bit to this, particularly in terms of in the context of the Serbia-Kosovo negotiations. But let me ask you one question. You recently wrote a very timely article about the important role that Voice of America plays in disseminating information, factual information abroad. Can you outline your main points and what are the shortcomings that you're addressing?
I'd be happy to. So the main point, and there are some technical aspects here to mention, but the main point is that authoritarians have figured out the information game and are winning at it. China through CGTN, Russia through RT and Sputnik, disinformation, fake news, social media controls and fake social media content, intervention in elections, on and on and on. They have figured this out and are doing quite well. We in the United States and we in the West more broadly are losing at this game now. We are not effectively promoting free information, accurate information, giving populations native language alternatives to that kind of Russian or other propaganda. Even smaller countries where there is a language barrier are able to shape the media environment much more assertively and effectively than had been the case in the past. So we need good, fair, balanced journalism in native languages promoted by U.S. broadcasting. We need to up our game, and that's a budgetary issue, it's a staffing issue, it's a mission issue. And then you see, the second piece of this is we're shooting ourselves in the foot. The U.S. Agency for Global Media has made a decision not to renew work visas for qualified journalists from abroad who are dedicating their careers to supporting the United States in providing free, fair, reliable information in native languages in local markets. And we desperately need people like that, and instead we're turning them away. So it was also an argument both to US AGM and to the Congress that let's not shoot ourselves in the foot and make our job harder. Let's actually welcome people who are trying to help us and even expand our efforts.
Right, exactly. And I know it's affecting some of the services, unfortunately, to our region, to the Balkans.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Let's turn now, Kurt, to policy of President Trump towards the region, specifically the Serbia-Kosovo talks. And to be fair, I think that the administration was very successful in helping to facilitate the let's say the compromise between Macedonia and Greece on the country's name, on pulling Macedonia, making sure that North Macedonia enters NATO. Also under this administration, Montenegro entered NATO. So I think a good deal has been achieved, to be absolutely fair. But how do you assess this meeting in the White House and the aftermath between Serbian leaders and leaders from Kosovo?
Well, I think it was useful from a number of perspectives. Obviously, it did not achieve mutual recognition and did not fully lift the trade embargo either. But I think it was useful to have a demonstration of U.S. interest, bring people to the White House, show that there is a perspective if they're able to sort things out. Second thing is that I think that Europe's approach to Kosovo-Serbia, particularly Germany's approach, is a bit too rigid. And I think the U.S. injecting a little bit more creativity into that was useful. My own view is that you need to work out mutual recognition and normalized relations between Serbia and Kosovo. If, in order to do that, both sides require a face saver in the form of swapping some territory and it's mutually agreed, I don't think we should be objecting to that. I don't think we lead with that because that itself does not solve any problems. But if it does lead to closure, then I think that can be on the table. That's missing, I believe, from the way Europe has handled this till now. There's a blanket rejection of any discussion of territory, which I think in some ways leads both sides just to sit still and not engage. So I think the U.S. engagement, injecting a little bit more creativity, but still insisting on the fundamentals, was actually useful. And it may open the door to another meeting, another effort under the next administration or continuation of Trump. It's a beginning.
So do you think the partition territorial exchange question can come back into the debate?
I think it can come back if it is part of a final deal. I don't think it solves anything on its own. And I think if you go with that without solving anything else, it's actually a very dangerous thing to do. Because you have plenty of other countries who will say, well, then we should have territorial swaps also. And then you start going into this atomization along ethnic lines, which, as we discussed earlier, I think is very dangerous in the Balkans. But in this particular case, if you are able to establish mutual recognition, normalization of trade, normalization of relations, and mutual agreement on borders, that would be quite significant and positive.
Right, I'm not sure that Vučić would be willing to surrender any part of the Preševo Valley, which has an Albanian majority of plurality in 3 municipalities, as well as recognizing Kosovo. But that's for another. That's
the thing. And if it doesn't, then no reason to pursue it any further. If it doesn't contribute to closure, but closing on normalization and closing on recognition and trade, those are critically important.
Well, one of the things, I mean, it's fine to have, I think, these economic agreements, but one sort of question I have is, can you have full economic normalization between two countries that don't recognize each other? I mean, to recognize passports, ease of travel, even a mini Schengen would require recognition of the legitimacy of the state, of the government that you're dealing with next door. And that doesn't apply because Serbia refuses to recognize Kosovo. So can you have economic normalization without interstate normalization?
Technically, yes. Both sides have to want to do it, which means that they would be agreeing on certain formulas to use that would be acceptable. But if you look, for instance, at Taiwan and mainland China, they both decided it's in their interest, and so they found ways to do this. I think the same thing could be done in the case of Kosovo and Serbia as well, if they wanted to. The situation right now is that Serbia doesn't want to.
Right. And actually, the European Union has said that many of these elements of the agreement are already being applied, through the European Union initiatives.
Yeah, no, that's true. And that's another discussion point. If instead of putting the two sides together to work out differences, they could both work toward integration and adoption of EU standards, that would be a way to solve some problems as well. Here, however, you run into the problem of a handful of European countries also not recognizing Kosovo as an independent state because of deference to Serbia, because of some of their own internal linguistic or cultural divisions. And so I'm skeptical that that approach of Europeanization is really going to deliver, although it is an argument that people make as well.
Yeah, it seems to me that this Europeanization process has run out of some of its steam. How do you see it in a sort of, particularly in a post-pandemic era? I mean, they're still dealing with Brexit. They seem to have a weak policy towards Russia. Macron is trying to act as the new head of Europe, which is somewhat laughable at times. Germany is in the middle of a transition. How do you see this applying to the Balkans? I mean, where does that leave the Balkans vis-a-vis the EU?
Yeah. So the main leading states of the European Union do not want the European Union to be any stronger or play a stronger role in foreign affairs, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on regional issues, economy. They have settled in to a state-centric EU in foreign affairs. Nobody likes to hear that. The Germans don't like to hear that when you tell them that, but it is effectively what they've done. As a result, someone like Borrell, who is nominally the High Representative, the Foreign Minister for the European Union, has very little authority to do much of anything. He announced today that he's going into a 2-week quarantine because he'd been on an airplane with someone who had COVID. I'm not sure we're going to see a meaningful difference in European foreign policy as a result of him being in quarantine for 2 weeks.
Let's turn last couple of questions on U.S. policy in particular and the potential, the next administration, which of course won't start until the end of January. We tend to think it's immediately after the elections, but there is this transition period. If there is a Biden presidency, I mean, Biden does have long-term connections in the Balkans dating back to the 1990s as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. His son served in Kosovo and so forth. He has a lot of connections and he's very well considered, very well respected. Maybe not so much in Belgrade, but certainly in the other capitals. How would you see any difference, any more commitments by Biden to the region?
Yeah, so I agree with you. First off, former Vice President Biden is very well informed about the region. He's traveled there many times. He knows the leaders. He has a real grasp of the region. Secondly, he has a very strong foreign policy team that is working with him on the campaign, who presumably would take senior jobs in a Biden administration. The difficulty for Vice President Biden is that politics will dominate what he needs to deal with as president if he's elected. He has a very strong left wing of the Democratic Party represented, for instance, through Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others, also Vice President nominee Kamala Harris, who will have expectations about focus and attention domestically and little patience for U.S. prioritizing foreign affairs. And so while I think he has the background and the relationships, I'm not sure it will lead to the degree of engagement that people are hoping for.
And in terms of the elections themselves, which are in just a couple of weeks' time, how important would you say are the diasporas from the region? There are certain populations in some of these key swing states in the Midwest that may play a role. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, where you do have sizable populations from not only from the Balkans, from the rest of Europe's east. How do you see their role in the elections? And will they, after the elections, could become more of a sort of a lobbying group vis-a-vis their region, vis-a-vis their countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. It has played a role in the past. During the 1990s and 2000s, when NATO enlargement was a very topical issue, you saw the Polish American community, the Baltic American community, Central European coalition, all play very significant roles in rallying their voters, their ethnic compatriots in swing states to support NATO enlargement. In 1996, Bob Dole came out in favor of NATO enlargement as part of his presidential campaign, and it forced Bill Clinton's hand to come out in support of NATO enlargement as well. Up until that point, he had not been in favor. So it can play a role. I'd have to say, though, that in this particular election, I'm not sure that they have unified in a way to favor one candidate or another. The issues are largely domestic. These states that we mentioned are swing states, but they are Rust Belt states, and people are looking at bringing manufacturing jobs back. And so you're torn between people wanting Trump for economic reasons and for protecting manufacturing and bringing jobs away from China to the U.S., as he claims to have done. And then you also have people who might say, but we'd like to see more U.S. leadership in support of our countries that our ancestors have come from, and maybe they would like to think Biden would do that. So I'm not sure it really favors one candidate or the other or plays a decisive role this time around.
Mm-hmm. Kurt, very last question, and this is sort of, I suppose, more forward-looking, not in terms of politics, but post-pandemic. We've had a lot of, I would say, apocalyptic predictions about the future after the pandemic and future pandemics. But zeroing in a little bit on how is this going to affect NATO? How is this going to affect the transatlantic alliance? Is it going to make us weaker? Is it going to make us stronger, or just different in ways that we cannot foresee?
Right. Well, let's start with NATO. NATO is fundamentally a commitment to collective defense, an attack on one being an attack on all. I don't see any change to that. In fact, I think countries actually reinforce their attachment to that because they feel they need to link to a broader sense of security. So I don't see an issue there. Where I do see an issue is the global economy has probably taken a bigger hit and will hurt for longer than people have actually estimated to this point. Things like international travel, things like industries that are connected to international trade, things like commercial real estate and residential real estate and urban real estate. There are lots and lots of ways in which our economies are going to be impacted for the long haul. And while we've come back maybe in a V-shaped curve halfway, getting the remaining half of that back is going to be very, very difficult and slow. And I think that will have an impact on the degree to which countries are looking for national solutions rather than multinational solutions. It'll continue this sense of decentralization within the European Union. It will cause the US to think more inwardly first before thinking about foreign affairs. And this provides a little bit of a vacuum, if you will, that China and Russia can try to exploit, being a bit more aggressive, more authoritarian, so they have consolidated decision-making and with a little bit of cash to throw around. And that makes for a very volatile environment coming in years ahead.
And in terms of defense funding, spending on security, is that to be constricted?
Yeah, I think we've seen maybe the peak in increases in defense spending, up to 2% of GDP in some cases under Trump. I think in a second term, you're going to see that level off, if not decrease again, as everyone, all of the developed democracies have gone into significant debt in order to try to keep the economy afloat during COVID-19. They're not going to feel they have the means to increase defense spending going forward. They're going to be able to look for areas of savings.
One last question on NATO, which didn't occur to me before. Any further enlargements on the horizon?
Not in the near term. I do think that this reflection group that is meeting and advising the Secretary General about future directions of NATO is looking at these questions. And I particularly think that Georgia has nothing in its way to joining NATO other than Russia's occupation of 20% of Georgian territory. I think that's something that NATO is going to have to start dealing with, that alone should not be a reason to hold a country back, because it incentivizes Russia to keep occupying territory, maybe even occupy more. So I think that that's one issue NATO is going to have to look at. In every other respect, Georgia's qualified. Ukraine has much further to go, but Ukraine has turned a corner since 2015. They are no longer ambivalent about their position as part of Europe and part of the West. They are 70% or more of the population committed to being a democracy, a modern European economy, and wanting to be part of Europe in every respect, including NATO. They're not ready now, but I think this is something where NATO and ultimately the European Union are going to have to be creating a perspective again for Ukraine, giving them a window where realization of these aspirations could be achieved someday. Right now, that aspiration does not appear realistic, and I think EU and NATO need to put it back on the table.
And of course, Kosovo is also waiting in the wings for possible future entry.
Yeah, Kosovo is in a much different position because of the recognition factors. A handful of European states still do not recognize Kosovo as a state, and you're never going to make progress on NATO or the EU until then. And that won't be resolved until there's an arrangement with Serbia. So it's right back to the conversation we were in. We need to inject some creativity and persistence in this to try to get to full recognition.
Okay, Kurt, clearly a lot on our agenda for the foreseeable future.
Opportunity to discuss it. It's a pleasure and great to see you.
Good to see you, Kurt. Welcome back. And I'm sure we're going to have you on again. On that note, unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I've greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues, both at VOA and at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.